Good morning, everyone. So the second presentation or session in our step-by-step series, and we've started with systematic reviews. And as I've indicated on the first session, even though systematic reviews and meta-analysis are quite an advanced type of research, yet if you start by doing a systematic review, you learn a lot about research. Also, you don't really need to have ethical approval. You are not involving human subjects or human participants because here you're doing research on studies. So you are actually collecting studies from the literature. While you do so, you learn a lot about research methodology, you learn a lot about critical appraisal. So you'll have very big steps in research, and this will prepare you very much to do any other type of research. So again, we are going to focus in this session about the research question. Now, the research question is a fundamental cornerstone in any type of research. If you want to do research, you want to add a new piece of information to mankind. And if you don't have a question, a very focused one, you will not reach your target. So your research question is by far the most important thing you need to think about. Because a systematic review is a form of research, it has to have a question. And before talking more about the question, I need to give an overview about the types of clinical studies in general, because as we've said, that a systematic review is research on studies. So, what types of studies are generally out there? So, clinical studies can be classified largely into experimental studies, but here the word experimental, by the word experimental, I don't mean experimenting on animals. These are human experiments because I'm talking about clinical studies. So I very commonly hear people saying clinical trial when they are talking about animal studies. This is not correct. When you're saying clinical study, you mean study on humans. Sometimes you experiment on humans. Sometimes you have to experiment on humans because you need to know the truth in science before applying any intervention to other human beings, before applying it generally to the population. So you need to experiment on humans. The experiments on humans are called clinical trials. And these are the gold standard methods of research when you want to prove that a certain intervention or therapy is beneficial. So, as you can see, experimental studies, or what we call clinical trials, or rather perfectly called randomized controlled trials, okay, can have several designs themselves. Some are parallel groups, some are crossovers, some have factorial design. We are going to discuss this in a separate session. The very other big, the other very big type of clinical research are observational studies, because not all the time you can experiment on human beings. Let's say you want to study the effect of a harmful exposure, like smoking, like bad nutritional habits. You will never randomize, or you will never experiment on human beings using something that you think is harmful. Okay, this is one of the applications of observational studies. So, observational studies are studies in which you are simply observing what's happening. You're examining medical records. You are making questionnaires. So, you're not really testing an intervention. These observational studies can also be classified into three main types. They are we have the cross-sectional studies, cohort studies, and case control studies. And again, I'm going to elaborate more on these later on. I had to say a word about the types of clinical studies before carrying on with the research question in a systematic review. Um, so the very basic question, um, or the very basic example that we usually work with is the example of the randomized control trial. Okay, so we are now exploring or setting the foundations of the research question in a randomized control trial. The research question in a randomized control trial, we give it an acronym that's called the PICO question. For a proper question of a randomized control trial, you need to define a population. Like, for example, you say you want to research on hypertensive patients. Your population are hypertensive patients. And you need to specify your intervention. So let's say you want to study the effect of a certain drug on hypertensive patients. That drug is going to be your intervention. To prove your point, you need to compare this group of people taking the new drug to a control group who are taking the standard treatment or who are taking placebo or who are taking no treatment, whatever may be the situation. So you have to define a population, you have to define an intervention, and you need to define the comparator. And then you need to define your outcome. What is the outcome you are interested in? What proves whether your intervention is beneficial or harmful, or let's say not beneficial or doesn't even have an effect? It's the outcome you are measuring. In this simple example that we are using, we are going actually to measure the blood pressure. So blood pressure will be our outcome. Why am I saying this question about the question for a randomized control trial? Because when you are doing a systematic review, you will have a similar question. But instead of recruiting human beings who are hypertensive and who are going to take a certain drug with a comparator group and measuring their blood pressure, no, you're not going to do this in a systematic review. You are going to search through the literature looking for studies addressing that question. So you are going to look for studies having the so-and-so population, which is hypertensive patients, studies that are using your defined medication, studies having a certain control group, if you're going to define the control and specify it, and studies that are measuring the outcome you are interested in. So in a clinical trial, you have to have a PICO question, and in a systematic review addressing the same question, you are looking for studies that are examining or researching that question. So here's another elaboration. So the patient or problem or the P, what is the most important character of your population? You need to define this population or patient group, and what is the intervention. It might be a form of treatment, whether medical or surgical. You might need to define your comparator and the outcome you are interested in. So, as I told you, in clinical research, investigators will collect data from individual patients. However, in systematic reviews, you are collecting data from studies on patients. So you might have the same PICO question for a clinical trial and for a systematic review. In the clinical trial, you're applying this question to patients. In a systematic review, you are looking for studies that have applied this question to patients. So not every topic will have the same PICO question. It depends upon your type of question. It depends. So there are types of research questions. We have the therapy question. Typically, this is the question in which you need to find or to retrieve or to search for a randomized control trial. And why is that? Again, I am going to define this in a special session about randomized control trials. Why a randomized control trial is the gold standard for proving the efficacy of a treatment or an intervention. So the gold standard for a therapy question and the gold standard for a therapy systematic review, a systematic review that looks into the effectiveness of an intervention, is randomized control trial. However, if your question concerns diagnosis, like what? If you're asking yourself, which is more accurate? Is it CT or MRI in diagnosing a certain condition? Here, you might use a randomized control trial and you might use what we call a cohort study. Okay? Or a cross-sectional study. So here, when you're addressing a diagnosis question, you have more designs can be available for you. Sometimes your question is about prognosis. What happens to these patients by time? Let's say I'm researching COVID-19 patients who have recovered. Okay, what about their prognosis? Are they going to have more incidence of allergies later on? Are they going to have more incidence of renal troubles, of vascular diseases, of cardiac diseases, whatever? So this is more or less a prognosis question. Typically, you use a cohort study for prognosis question. And if your prognosis question is the question for your systematic review, you are looking for primary studies that have cohort design. If you are looking into harm, like what is the effect of smoking on a certain parameter, you are not going to use a randomized control trial. Again, you will be looking for a cohort study. So if this is the question of your systematic review, then your primary studies, the studies that you are looking for, will be cohort studies basically. And the study designs and the types of questions are just endless. And the more you are experienced with research, the more you understand about special designs and special features and special situations. So with this, I end this short session and until we meet in the next session. Thank you.